Good morning. I'm Annise Parker. I'm the former mayor of the city of Houston and the president and CEO of the LGBTQ Victory Fund. It's really great to be with you this morning. For those of you who don't know, Victory is the only national organization devoted to helping LGBTQ leaders achieve public office, either elected or appointed. Every level, every state, and we've been doing it for 29 years. This year, there's an incredible number of candidates, more than 850 out LGBT candidates who are running across the country. And Victory's committed to making sure that we help those candidates have the tools they need to succeed. It's a tough year with the pandemic. Campaigns are having to pivot to do more online, as we're doing today. But our candidates are inventive and energetic, and they're making the transition. Our job at Victory is to help them do that. We have a sister organization. We are Victory Fund and we are Victory Institute, which is our nonprofit side. Today, this is an event for Victory Fund, and we hope you'll check out our website, victoryfund.org. I'd also like you to check out a map that we maintain. If you go to outforamerica.org, you can see every sitting LGBT elected official in the country. And we hope that you'll enjoy seeing how representation is changing in America and how the face of American politics is more representative because the LGBT community is part of it. Today, we're going to have a conversation with two of our favorite people, one of whom many of you know from his presidential campaign, but the other, Jonathan Capehart, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, is going to be the moderator of the conversation. Jonathan?
Good morning, Mayor Parker. How are you, and happy birthday?
Oh, thank you. I am doing well. And the other part of our conversation, also Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Really glad to see you again. Jonathan, you're not a stranger to Victory, and obviously Pete isn't a stranger to Victory. You had an opportunity to follow his campaign and report on his campaign and interview him while he was running. And then Pete, we saw a lot of each other. I could have given your campaign speech, I think, because I was in a lot of rooms with you. But, Pete, we knew you when you were mayor, and we supported you when you were running for re-election as mayor. And I know early on when you announced your campaign, we had a conversation and I said, we're going to watch you and see how you do. And that's one of the things that I want to emphasize to the audience, that Victory cares very much about representation, and we are excited to have everyone running who's running across America, those 850 folks. But as an organization, we're committed to making sure that the most viable campaigns can prove themselves and have the resources they need to be successful. And while you weren't the first openly LGBT presidential candidate, you were the first one that we ever endorsed. We had the opportunity to do that during Pride Week in New York, the anniversary of Stonewall. And I can still tear up when I think about that night and how proud it was. And I bet Jonathan has a little bit of that same feeling, or I suspect he does. So Jonathan, what was it like interviewing and interacting with a viable presidential campaign or a presidential candidate from our community?
Well, I first met Mayor Pete and interviewed Mayor Pete at the Washington Post in December of 2018. We'd never met before. I'd only heard a little bit about him. But in the middle of the interview, I remember just sitting there thinking, oh my God, this guy is incredible. Nobody knows who he is right now, but they will. And I remember telling folks on the editorial board, I just interviewed the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, and mark my words, and they all looked at me like I had four heads. They're not looking at me like that now. And so, I think I said this to Politico, the same feelings I had in 2008 watching and covering President Obama's successful campaign for president as an African American, the same feelings were there watching Mayor Pete run for president of the United States in a remarkable, smart, incredible way. And it was wonderful to see that aspect of my identity represented in such a fantastic way.
So, Pete, I know that you got your hair cut from Chasten. Has someone come along behind and fixed it since then?
No, we've just refined our skills. So add to the list of many professions that are commanding more respect than ever in this pandemic, that of barbers, because they make it look easy. But I think we're back to semi-normal here. We'll see what the next round brings.
Well, we are all in our respective homes in our respective cities, and we were talking earlier. We have the Battle of the Bookcases behind us, although I'm going to give high marks to Jonathan. Again, I'm Annise Parker, President and CEO of the LGBTQ Victory Fund. I hope folks will visit our website, and I'm going to drop off this conversation and listen to you guys talk. Thank you for spending your Sunday morning with us.
Thanks, Mayor Parker.
Thanks for having me. Glad to the birthday greetings.
Thank you.
And Mayor Pete, again, thank you very much for doing this. Great to see you again. I think the last time we saw each other was in South Carolina, just after I interviewed Chasten. Let's talk about your presidential campaign. You're the first openly gay Democrat to run for president and make a real run of it, a real go of it. How did you navigate the challenges and opportunities that presented?
Well, I think from day one, we were very conscious of the responsibility that came with the historic nature of the campaign. And the important thing for me was to make sure that as many Americans as possible saw their future reflected in the story that we were telling about where the country could go. And knowing that for many LGBTQ Americans, it was the first time they really did see themselves reflected in a way that they could connect to in a candidate. And at the same time, of course, when you run for president, you're running to be president for everybody, not just running to be president of the gay United States of America, but for everybody. And so the important thing for me, I think, was to make sure that at every turn, it was clear that that identity was part of who I am, that I was proud of it, that it was part of what shaped my worldview, and that it was part of a bigger picture about where our country was going. Because I think for so many of us, so many go through the struggle of coming out, and then once we are out, a lot of people, I think, go through the struggle of how to not be any more defined by your identity than you want to be, but to be as connected to your identity as you choose to be. And that was really, I think, the remarkable thing about this whole experience, from those first days where people were looking at us funny, and the audacity or the improbability of doing it at all was I think the main thing on people's minds, to when we began being taken seriously. And as Mayor Parker said, even an organization that is stoutly committed to making sure there's more LGBTQ representation wasn't just going to say, "Oh, great, you're gay, cool, we're for you, here we come." They wanted to see a demonstration of viability too. And I think for a lot of people in the community, there was that question of not only, what does it mean to see out there, but do you really have a shot?
I want to remind everyone that you can actually submit questions for me to ask Mayor Pete via Facebook, by Facebook chat. Mayor Pete, talk about maybe the most touching or impactful moment on the campaign, because as you said, a lot of people looked and probably for the first time saw themselves in someone reaching for and aspiring for an incredible position and making a real viable go of it. Was there a moment that stands out in the campaign that moved you, touched you in a particular way?
There were so many moments when I would interact with a family, and sometimes it would be off stage and talk to a parent and a teenager. I'm thinking of a young Nevadan named Adi, for example, a trans young person who became really involved in the campaign. But also Adi's mom was letting me know just how important this experience had been to them. Same thing in Iowa, where we met parents who believed that the fact of the campaign was life-saving for their teenage son. And to have that experience and to see, on one hand, I suppose it shouldn't surprise you that, after all, we're talking about the presidency, and a serious run at the presidency will have big consequences. But when you're actually just backstage or on a rope line shaking hands, or in one of those moments in between the big kind of banner headline moments that get most of the attention, you just have a human conversation with somebody about how the simple fact of your campaign let them know in some way they hadn't seen before that they belonged. There was a lot of power in that. And what really meant a lot to me was when there was a kind of intersectional power to it. I often told the story of Bridget, who I met in a backyard in Iowa in the summer months of the campaign, when you're really campaigning, one backyard and a county event at a time. And she came up and after I said my piece and said that our campaign had let her feel a different sense of belonging than she'd had before, and that she now knew that she didn't have to be ashamed of herself, even though she had autism. And autism wasn't something we had talked about a lot in the campaign at that point. But there was something about the broader spirit of the campaign's commitment to belonging that was, of course, very much rooted in my gay identity and I think the story of being the first Democratic elected official, even to make the attempt, and then go on to be the first to lay claim to winning a state. That across that story, many people in very different ways, some of which I never could have predicted, saw some part of themselves reflected in our story.
Now, because the presumptive Democratic nominee, Joe Biden, has already said that he's going to choose a woman to be his vice presidential candidate, you don't have to worry about any of the speculation. But I would love for you to talk about your view of where the presidential race is right now. A lot of people are talking about the fact that Vice President Biden is, quote unquote, stuck in his basement and President Trump is commanding the airwaves. Do you see it that way? Do you feel a sense of anxiety about where the presidential race is vis-a-vis the presumptive Democratic nominee?
I understand where that's coming from, but I think of it this way. You will never get as much attention by being an upstanding, healthy, forward-looking, proper presidential candidate as the attention you will get as a sitting president making an ass of yourself. So if we're just talking about quantity of attention, then yeah, I mean, there's nothing that Joe Biden can do or any normal functioning candidate could do that will get in our heads as much as the president of the United States speculating on the medical value of injecting yourself with disinfectant, right? So that's not the standard we should be looking at. What we should be looking at is, do we have a campaign that is laying out the contrast between what life would be like in our country under a good leader and what life is like in our country right now? And by that measure, I think that things are very much headed in the right direction. One of the reasons that I quickly decided to support Joe Biden almost as soon as I had decided that my own campaign was at an end was not just that I believed he was best positioned to lead the ticket and to beat this president, but because there's a quality of compassion and empathy that's always been central to his message. You remember when he got into the race, he talked a lot about the soul of the nation. He's characterized by a kind of empathy and compassion that I think is as needed now as just general competence, which we also know we need a lot more of in our federal government. And what we're seeing right now is that the stakes of this election have gone even higher than they were a few months ago, which is hard to believe, right? I mean, if you'd say in December, this election is actually going to become a much more high stakes affair than it already is. I would say, how is that possible? That it could not be more important. And sure enough, a world historical emergency has come along that's made it even more important. And so it's going to be important to innovate and to find new ways to campaign. And every campaign, from people I'm talking to running for county office and school board, all the way up to Joe Biden's presidential campaign, are of course working through and wrestling with the different ways that we need to do this. But the bottom line is that the message has to make sense. And his message is one of restoring the soul of this country, being America at its best, and having people in charge who know what they're doing. And that's the message that I think will command a majority of support across this country.
Well, I keep looking down at my notes because this question that I asked you was based off a question from Tim Anderson, who asked more specifically, does Joe Biden have the best team assembled to break through and show up how he needs to during these unprecedented times? What else can we do to ensure that the current post doesn't win a second term? Joe is a great candidate, but we have to pull out all the stops as we know the current president will do whatever he needs to for a second term. So what else can we do to ensure that there is not a second Trump term?
Well, I think the main thing is to realize it's not just on campaign staff, senior campaign staff, to invent new ways that campaigning ought to work. It's also on us. So think about if you're the kind of person, as I know so many people on this call are, whose instinct would be to find the campaign headquarters, throw open the doors, march through, and Roger up to knock on doors. And obviously, you can't do that now. What does it mean to carry that instinct into some kind of action right now? And there are ways to do it. Just the other day, I was on an organizer meeting and volunteer training, about 1,000 people in Virginia for the Biden campaign. And it's now about a lot of neighbor-to-neighbor work that's more over the phone. There's a lot of training going on in being digital champions. In other words, taking that same spirit that would have you holding a sign on a street corner as part of visibility and bringing it online to your friends and family. This stuff really matters more than ever, actually, that we be reaching out to the people in our lives. And in our campaign, we focused on a model we called Relational Organizing, which is about finding the people who have real life relationships with your volunteers and making sure they hear the message, because it's always more convincing to hear a message from somebody in your own life saying, here's why I'm voting for Joe Biden. Here's why I'm hoping you will, compared to just seeing an ad or other traditional campaign ways of getting to people. So yes, he's got a great campaign team, and it's actually largely from competing against campaigns led by Jen O'Malley Dillon, his campaign manager, that I know how talented and capable she is, and so many great people in the campaign. But if we really want to talk about the team, the quality of the team, that's all of us. That's all of us who believe in making sure that we don't have a second election. The question's exactly right. A second Trump term in this election, and the question's exactly right. Going into this election, Trump and his allies will do everything in their power. I mean, if they didn't stop at foreign interference, they're not going to stop at anything this time around. And remember that there are two pressures working in opposite directions right now, at least in my opinion. One of them is that the pressure of circumstance is making this a better and better year for not just Joe Biden, but for Democrats across the board. I think the Senate is in play in a way that we didn't really dare to believe in 2 or 3 months ago, because people are seeing the consequences of the terrible mismanagement of those in charge. Now, the pressure that's moving in the opposite direction is the mechanics of elections. We've got to be incredibly vigilant right now to make sure that there are free and fair, accessible elections with opportunities to vote by mail and safe opportunities to vote in person for those who cannot or are unlikely to vote by mail. That's not going to be a small thing, and we've got to make sure that problems related to just the conduct of elections don't take away from the opportunity in front of us to really have the American people speak with a clear voice about the need for change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to ask you about your new PAC, Win the Era PAC, but I do want to bring in a question from a fellow mayor, the mayor of Madison, Wisconsin, Mayor Satya Rhodes Conway. And she asks, what advice do you have for mayors and others in local government as we deal with COVID-19 and the associated economic impacts?
Well, first, let me say mayors are doing a phenomenal job, and it's great to be connected virtually with Mayor Rhodes Conway, because I've kept track of the wonderful job she's doing in Madison. And in the absence of good leadership in the White House, it's falling to local leaders and local decision makers to do a lot of the heavy lifting. The first thing that I think is really making a big difference is clarity and consistency in terms of what residents are being asked to do, making sure that the message lets people know that there's a spectrum between free for all and total lockdown, that there are steps you can take from masks to how you go about doing things that you really do need to go in terms of going out and getting groceries or whatever it is, that makes this feel like something we can sustain for a longer time. Some of it's this intangible quality of reassurance, right? Letting people know that we are going to come through this and reinforcing a sense of trust. Because I actually think in obvious ways, but also in very subtle ways, the way we trust each other and trust neighbors and trust institutions is going to be a very important ingredient in how we get through this. I guess again, I'm hesitant to give advice to a mayor who's doing such a great job, and mayors who I know are all over this because you've been forced to by circumstance. But the one thing that I would say is especially important right now is to think a few steps ahead. This has hit us with such force that I think at each turn we've been very much absorbed in the moment. First, it was making sure we could figure out how to just get some masks and then get access to ventilators. And now it's more about getting access to testing. Think about how hard it's going to be when a vaccine actually is invented and developed to make sure everybody gets it. It's not like the moment that it's invented in a lab is the moment our troubles end. Actually distributing it, prioritizing access to it, ensuring people have enough trust that they'll make use of the vaccine. These are things that may sound like a far off challenge given the just absolute house on fire emergency we're living with getting through each day. But thinking ahead to that, I think, is one of the areas where mayors and local authorities can actually make a big difference, because that is going to be a challenge. And how we navigate that will make as much of an impact, I think, on the long-term success or failure of this country in dealing with that crisis as the steps that are happening all around us, and things like calibrating how to loosen the stay-at-home orders.
All right, so let's talk about Win the Era PAC. Marcia asks a question from Facebook, and she wants you to talk about what you want to accomplish with Win the Era PAC. And I'll add on top of that, how could it positively impact LGBTQ candidates?
Great. So we are really excited that just last week, actually, we announced the first slate of 22 endorsements for the Win the Era PAC. The objective is basically to practice what I was always preaching on the presidential campaign when I said that we cannot treat the presidency like the only office that matters.
Right.
Excuse me. So you know that I'm all in for Joe Biden and working very hard to make sure that we get him elected president. Much like the Victory Fund, I believe it's extremely important to pay attention to other races too. And so what we're doing with Win the Era PAC is identifying candidates who capture in some way the values or the spirit of the Pete for America campaign. We can't come even close to endorsing everybody that we believe in, but we have been able to, I think, put forward a number of candidates who collectively tell a story about the kind of leadership looking to the future, including leadership for a new generation that's really going to make a difference. So some of our endorsements are going to be very familiar names to anybody who follows politics closely. Somebody like Roy Cooper, governor in North Carolina, a state that is really, in a beautiful way, challenging the assumptions about conservative strangleholds in the South. Now it's so important, especially because he became governor in the wake of some really terrible anti-trans legislation when he was up in 2016. I think it's really important to back him and support him going forward. But a lot of our candidates are people you probably won't have heard of unless they're near you. But I'm really excited to lift up people like Jevin Hodge, who is a candidate for county office in Maricopa County, where Phoenix and Mesa, Arizona are. May not be the most glamorous office, but I can tell in his campaign for county supervisor that he's going to bring a level of intention and long-termism that is just really exciting and is going to be a leader to watch for a long time. Candidates like Lamont Robinson, who is in Illinois. Actually, I think the first time I met him was through a Victory Fund event in Illinois. First out Black state representative in that state, doing really compelling work to make sure that constituents in his area of Chicago are looked after, both in the context of this emergency and with a bigger eye toward economic empowerment. We've got candidates like Gina Ortiz-Jones in Texas, a veteran, somebody who is this close to flipping a seat that was held by Will Hurd and is now an open seat. But also Sharice Davids, who's in Kansas right now, and again, a real friend to so many of us in in the Victory community who want to be sure that she and frontline freshman members of Congress like her remain in office. So I'd invite you to visit wintheera.com and learn more about our candidates. It's a wonderful, very diverse array of candidates looking to the future, and a lot of exciting LGBTQ leaders among them. And really just thrilled with the response we've had since unveiling them, and hope that anyone who is a believer in what my campaign was about will look at ways to support these candidates too, because they're the kinds of people we're going to need in office at every level to make this country a better place in the years ahead.
Well, I think I was about to ask you this question from Mona Smith, because she wanted to know what was the criteria that you use to figure out who to endorse in this first slate of candidates. And if you listen to the names that you presented and the parts of the country that they're in, you kind of got a feel. But did you have a checklist of things, of qualities, of ideas that you went through in order to decide who to endorse this first go round? And is that being used for the second slate of endorsees? And when is that going to be?
Absolutely, yes. So I wouldn't say there was a formula, but there was definitely a series of attributes that we were looking for. One of them was generational leadership. That means many of them are from what I would consider our successor generation. Others distinguish themselves just because the issues they focus on matter for a future generation. Another was belonging, and making sure we have candidates who are actively creating that sense of belonging in a way, again, that I think is especially important as we look at LGBTQ and LGBTQ friendly leadership. We're also looking for pioneering candidates. I'm really excited about candidates who maybe cut a little bit against the grain in terms of their profile. Maybe they're progressive candidates in a red state, or the first of their identity to succeed. I'm thinking about candidates like Lauren Underwood in a suburban African-American representative in a majority white district who's really demonstrated the way that she can bring a kind of leadership that benefits that district in so many ways. I'm thinking about Michelle De La Isla, mayor of Topeka, Kansas, running for U.S. House, another exciting Kansas candidate in this notionally red state where there's a ton of opportunity. But her story as a young mother, having experienced homelessness in Puerto Rico, going on to lead with competence and compassion in Topeka, really brings out that pioneering quality. And we were looking for people who embodied what we like to call the rules of the road on our campaign. We governed our campaign just in terms of the way we did business by certain qualities and values that we held ourselves to: respect, again, belonging, teamwork, substance, discipline, excellence, joy, a whole series of values that really anchored the culture of our campaign. And we sought out candidates who reflect that. And yes, we're already thinking about a future round of endorsements. So if you are interested in maybe helping, again, I love nothing more than learning about somebody who's working in obscurity but deserves more attention, and love to hear about those candidates. And so if there are people on your radar, LGBTQ candidates or candidates of any background, definitely let us know through wintheera.com or Twitter or other ways to reach us, because I don't have a date for it, but we are actively working on a future round too.
I don't know, Mayor Peter, were you able to see that question that popped up on the bottom of the screen? I don't know if anyone else saw that, but someone was asking, I thought there it is, from Elliot Oppenheim. How are the rules of the road informing the decisions you are making within the air?
Oh, good. All right. Well, great minds think alike. Oh, I see it now. Yeah, on the view here. So, a lot of it is considering those values and their relevance to the long term. One of them, for example, was boldness. And we always believe, it's one of the reasons I thought it was important to lead the field in some of our proposals around democratic reform, all the way through to contemplating the future structure of the Supreme Court. I mean, really deep questions that might take a generation and a couple of constitutional amendments to answer, but now's the time. This is an example of a belief or a tenet that I think has become even more important now, because we're in this emergency where the way our country emerges from the pandemic, the answer to that question is nothing short of the question of how our political and social and economic arrangements are going to look for, I think, the next half century. I mean, not since the New Deal have we seen a crisis called for new thinking in a way that has the potential to have such reverberating impact on the way we live for the future. And even though this feels like a bleak moment, that could be really, really positive, because we know we're not going to go back to the old way. We can't, and we shouldn't. So what's next? And so, many of these values have taken on new meaning, joy as well, actually. So one that we always focused on was, especially because so many moments in campaign life and political activism are characterized by a kind of grim determination, and that's how it is sometimes. But
Right.
all the more reason to be intentional about bringing a kind of joy to the privilege of being involved in shaping the future. And I think that's one we ought to force ourselves to think about from time to time. And so all of these values are alive in the work that we're doing through Win the Era and the associated 501c4, and just the work I'm trying to do and the approach I'm trying to bring to everything from working with researchers on pandemic response to teaming up with allied organizations like Victory Fund to make sure we keep getting great people elected to office.
When you were talking about the criteria for your endorsees, you said, and I wrote it down, so I was off camera for a little bit. You wrote down progressive candidate progressive candidates in red states as a way of talking about endorsing candidates who go against the grain, and that dovetails nicely with a question from Jordan, who asks, how do we support LGBTQ candidates in rural conservative areas to run for office, and what are strategies for them to win?
So that's such an important question, because the queer experience is really, really different depending on where you live, right? And I think sometimes there's a risk of forgetting that as we spend time in wonderfully supportive communities. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are challenges everywhere, even the most progressive quarter, the most progressive city in America. But you think about the difference between being an out candidate in one of our larger, more liberal coastal cities versus weighing the pressures of being an out candidate or office holder in a conservative area, just as it's different for individuals. And the challenge is still colossal. And so I think the most important thing is to recognize the added value of, let's assume that there are roughly as many LGBTQ people in one part of the country as there are in any other, roughly. We know that the lack of representation means that even seeing if you're in Marshall County, Indiana, or a part of Oklahoma, you may well have been led to believe that you're totally alone. I mean, I remember going through high school, not knowing a single out LGBTQ person, not one. And even though that was some years ago, I know that's still the experience for a lot of people now. And so the presence of even a single out candidate, let alone a single successful out candidate, can be electrifying for people who live there. And again, some of the most compelling mail that came into my campaign was from people who were from those areas. Now, the good news is we're talking about a lot of areas that also pride themselves on a kind of ethic in terms of how people treat each other interpersonally. That definitely collides with prejudice and bigotry, but often it wins. I've seen it around here in Indiana. And so I think the more moral support and frankly financial support through efforts like the Victory Fund we can provide to those candidates, who can then tell a story that's maybe not always about themselves, but about the people they want to serve, the more it'll reach people and help them first look past LGBTQ identity and then look right at it, but look at it differently. I think about Danica Roem and the way that she was out and proud transgender candidate. Was one of the most exciting things about her candidacy. But also, if you asked her what was on her mind when she was first running, it was always about the traffic on Route 22 or 20. I think it was Route 22. I mean, I felt like I, just by having seen her speak a few times, was like as if I had experienced that traffic jam. It must have been really brutal. And she was laser focused on it, right?
Yep.
And so I'm sure that allowed her to relate to people who, if they knew one thing about her, that she was trans, were going to have a lot of trouble feeling a connection to her. But if they knew two things about her, that she was trans and that she was obsessed with solving that traffic problem, then they had connected with her on one thing and could learn how to connect on the other thing. So I think that same kind of process is really important for candidates who are in rural conservative areas.
Mm-hmm.
The metaphor that I carry around for this is rock climbing, where you have one hand and 1 foot, or maybe 3 of your limbs firmly planted on something, right? On issues that people can see through and relate to. And then that frees up your 4th to reach and grab something else. So the planted parts are where you're connected on issues that people already know matter to them. And then the reach, that's the part where you lead them to see something they hadn't understood was important, or to look past a prejudice that maybe they didn't even know they held. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is how progress is made. And it's in our more conservative and rural areas that we have the greatest potential to make just that kind of progress.
Your example of Danica Roem is so perfect and apt, because after she had won election, it was when I first met her. And I asked the question about her opponent and how her opponent tried to use her gender identity against her, and how did that make her feel? And I was trying to get her to give me something more, just to talk about it. And she went right to traffic. She's still there. She's still on it, but it proved to be successful. I don't think it's any secret that at some point you're probably going to run for president again. I'm just going to put that out there. So in between that time, when that time comes again, because we all know it's going to happen, what do you hope to do beyond win the era, beyond helping to get Joe Biden elected president of the United States? What's the one or the 2 things you would like to do to better prepare yourself for that next time you run? Because we all know you're going to run again.
Well, I mean, the goals of running for president are the same as my goals in doing anything else that's not running for president, which is to make myself useful. And so, part of how you do that is to go out there and do stuff. It was the motivator for me running for local office here in my hometown. It's what's motivating me right now with efforts like Win the Era to make myself useful to other candidates who are going to be on the ballot this year, knowing that I'm not. And then there are times when the best thing you can do to make yourself more useful in the world is to step back and think and read and write and grow that way. And I've got an awful lot of growing to do. So, I'm thankful for being healthy and having a home where I can more or less comfortably hunker down with Chasten and the dogs during this time, and trying to make the most of the chance to do both of those things. I mean, usually the consolation of a campaign ending is you get your life back. And of course, in some ways, that's not true this time around, because the moment my campaign ended was just maybe 10 days before everything started shutting down. But on the other hand, there are a lot of things just in my own life. My marriage, it's a hell of a thing to do to your first year of your marriage to
really
run for president.
Right.
So we're taking the opportunity in this second year of our marriage to make the most of our time together, and we're definitely setting an all-time household record for the number of meals we've had at the table that we've cooked. Well, mostly that he's cooked, and
I was about to ask, who's the cook?
I'm the sous chef. He's perfected everything from buttermilk pancakes to Brussels sprouts to this salmon with a glaze on it. So I'm content to do mostly cleaning and chopping and supportive activities. But I'll tell you, a small thing like that is such a blessing when you spend a year, eating literally the majority of your meals in vehicles, and to actually eat at a table, let alone eat at a table in your home, a meal prepared with someone you love. That's not a small thing, and it's one of the many blessings that I'm conscious of having right now. So not just on the political front, but the personal front, trying to make the most of every moment, because we don't know what the future is going to look like.
I have one more question to ask you before the final question, and I don't want it to go by because it's a special one from Maria on Facebook, and she asked, "How did it feel to learn about Zachary, the young person whom you inspired to come out?
That entire rally was kind of an out-of-body experience. We were in Denver, I think. Pretty sure, yeah, we were in Colorado. Thousands of people filling this space. And one of the things I thought was always important was to try to have questions everywhere we go. We had a president who basically abolished press briefings, thought transparency and accountability were very important. And so it got harder and harder. It's one thing when you got 60 people in a backyard in New Hampshire, it got harder and harder to do, but we realized we could always still at least gather up written questions, kind of rustle them around in this fishbowl. And then someone would moderate after I gave my speech, and we'd take a few questions. It was almost always the best part of an event. And even with thousands of people, you could do it. And so, but I always tried to point to find out where the person was who was having the question. And by the end, you've heard most of the questions. It's still worth having the masks live, but what are we going to, how are we going to bring the party together when there's such a range of ideologies? What is it going to be like trying to debate Donald Trump? What can we do more on mental health? You knew the questions that were coming. This kid has this question of how he can summon the courage to tell friends and family and loved ones that he believes he's gay. And of course, he's already summoned the courage by putting in the question. And I didn't want to, you always want to be careful when you have a question like that. So I didn't kind of, I can't remember exactly how I did it, but he identified himself. He decided to identify himself in the crowd. And then we had him come up on stage. And just to see, in the eyes of a kid that age, who was fortunate also to have clearly a very supportive family, was so moving because, of course, I wonder if I were that age and had any idea that my being who I was figuring out I was would have been embraced or validated by a national political figure. I wonder all the different ways my life might have been different. And when you see a kid who's that kind of conscious of his own identity at such a young age, you just think about how much promise there is in this generation. I'm supposed to be the youngster, and I'm waxing romantic now about the possibilities for our country, knowing that there's this future generation that just has remarkable qualities among them. And so, in addition to wishing young Zachary well, it also just made me feel good about what could happen as my generation's putting our feet up in retirement, looking at those who were formed in these, in many ways, very hard years, and what they're going to bring when they're taking over.
Well, Mayor Pete, before we go, of course, I've got to ask you to answer this question. What should people know about the LGBTQ Victory Fund?
Well, first of all, the Victory Fund was such a wind at our back in my campaign, my first national endorsement. And as Mayor Parker said at the beginning of this webcast, it was a really extraordinary and emotional announcement on the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising. And to think about the progress that had been made and the progress yet to go, and to know that I had at my side an organization like Victory was just critically important for our ability to make history. And frankly, even if you were supporting another of the candidates in the race, I think that the chance to make that kind of history and the role that Victory played in that was just extraordinary. And so, knowing that the Victory Fund was there for me, it's very important for me to be there for Victory. And so I'm hoping everyone here, especially knowing that this is a complicated and challenging time, but I hope if you're able, you will join me in financially supporting such an important organization. And there's an easy way to do it. There's a link on your screen that will take you directly to a way to do it. Look, the campaign support that the Victory Fund provided for me, they're providing that kind of support for school board candidates, state leg candidates, candidates for Congress. I shared earlier the story of a teenager who was having just a ferocious struggle in his rural Iowa school. And his parents believed our campaign may have saved his life in some way, but part of his struggle was to get a GSA recognized, to have the chance to fly a pride flag. And I remember thinking, I'm glad that there was a presidential candidate to lift this young man up. But What he really needed was a sympathetic school board member who could have helped make that difference closer to home. I think about the difference it made when I came out as mayor, the people who wrote in. My point is that representation needs to happen at every level, and Victory is working at every level to make sure that that happens. And that's what we're asking you to support. And even though this is a tough year, this is also an extraordinary year because the Victory Fund is poised to support more candidates than at any time in the 29-year history of the organization. So to the extent that we can work this game plan, which of course all just depends on how generous we can be in supporting the Victory Fund, this could actually be a banner year, even as it's also a tough year. And we can see that echoed in states and communities across the country where we have out candidates running. So, think about the chance to fight for a better future in America. Think about a chance to change America's politics and policies, but also just think about what it means to have role models for LGBTQ youth who don't often see people like them in positions of power. And again, I'll leave you with this: just the most moving moments in my campaign were from an 8 or 9-year-old kid like Zachary in Colorado to sometimes someone my parents' age walking up to me in an airport or someplace, not even able to speak, but just in the eye contact, I could see what they were telling me this campaign meant for them. The closer to home, the more it means. And that's where the range of what Victory does matter so much. So I hope you will find the link in the Facebook comment box. I hope you'll click and do what you can, because the Victory Fund and the candidates that they back need your support.
Mayor Pete, thank you very much for spending part of your Sunday with us. Thank you very much for being here. Our best to Chasten.
Thank you. I wouldn't be a good husband if I didn't mention he's just announced his a book coming out called I Have Something to Tell You, which I think is going to be a great read. So warmest regards from both of us here in South Bend, and I'm looking forward to seeing you and so many of our friends from the Victory Fund community in person whenever circumstances allow.
And thank you all for tuning in. That is it for this Sunday brunch. Thanks again.